My own son left me standing in the middle of a storm as if I were a complete stranger. The door was right there, just a few steps away, but to me, it had never felt so far. Before I go on with this story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Every comment is a reminder that dignity is never begged for, and every subscription is another voice against the ingratitude that poisons so many families. The rain poured down that afternoon, heavy sheets of water cutting through the gray sky and hammering the pavement like 1,000 nails. I stood there, the collar of my soaked coat clinging to my neck, my shoes sinking into shallow puddles. I knocked twice. Silence. I waited. I looked at the lit window. I knew he was home. The cold wasn't only from the water dripping down my face. It came from inside, from the emptiness of being ignored by someone I once carried in my arms. Each passing minute stretched into an eternity, and with every second, the weight of humiliation grew heavier. It felt as if the whole world was watching. Neighbors peeking from behind their curtains, the dog that barked and then fell silent, even the watch on my wrist ticking each minute like a blow to the chest. I took a deep breath, trying not to let the trembling expose my weakness. I could have left. I could have found shelter somewhere else, but I stayed. I stayed because I still believed that at any moment the door would open and I'd hear, "Sorry, Dad, I didn't see you there." But the only sound that reached me was the sharp click of the lock, closing. At that moment, it wasn't the rain that soaked me. It was shame. The memory of all the nights I worked overtime to pay for his college. The image of my old pickup truck sold just to cover the last tuition bills. And there I was, a father who had given everything, reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience left standing in the storm. I looked down. The water reflected the yellow glow of the streetlight. I saw myself in that reflection, shrunken, dim, invisible. I felt as if the whole world had turned its back on me, and I realized that maybe right then I was living the deepest betrayal of all, not from a stranger but from my own blood. A car passed slowly. The driver glanced through the window, curious, then drove off. That look of pity burned more than the rain itself. It proved my pain was no longer mine alone. It had become a silent spectacle for anyone to witness. I was the old man left behind, the rejected father, and no one interrupted the scene, not even him. I closed my eyes. My heart raced, not from the cold, but from anger, a quiet anger, growing in silence, like a flame hidden beneath ashes. And there, on that wet porch, I made a vow to myself that silence would not go unanswered. One day, he would feel the same waiting, not in the rain, but in a place far more bitter. Maybe I didn't speak the words out loud. Maybe they dissolved in the noise of the downpour. But inside, the promise was clear. I would not always be the man ignored. Life, one way or another, would give me the chance to show the difference between humility and humiliation. I still remember the sound of the rain hitting the wood of that locked door, the breath caught in my chest, the knot in my throat, the urge to scream and the fear of not being heard. That scene never left my mind, because it wasn't just a door that closed on me. It was a part of my dignity that stayed, trapped on the other side. And that's why I never forgot that afternoon, because it was there, soaked, alone, humiliated, that a new part of me was born. The part that learned that even silence can be a weapon, that even waiting can turn into revenge. What he didn't know, and maybe still doesn't, is that every drop of rain that fell on me that day was the warning of the storm that would one day fall on him. That night, after coming home still wet, I sat in the worn-out armchair in the living room and stared at the wall. The old clock ticked slowly, every beat echoing as if mocking my silence. The weak lamp flickered, throwing shadows over the furniture I had built with my own hands. Every table, every chair, every detail of that house carried my mark. It was as if the walls themselves shouted who I was. But outside, nobody seemed to listen anymore. My house had always been simple. Bare brick walls, wood polished by hand, the smell of coffee lingering in the curtains. No luxury, no display of wealth. But there was truth in every crack of the wall, in every piece of sturdy furniture that had endured decades. That was my legacy. That was the story I had built with sweat and calloused hands. In that silence, faces of my family flashed before me, like scenes from a film I couldn't pause. My eldest son, Michael, the lawyer, the man who always raised his voice at family gatherings, as if every sentence were an argument in court. I remembered him as a fragile baby, small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. And now, he drove a luxury car, lived in a 2-story house in the wealthiest neighborhood, surrounded by people who applauded him at elegant dinners. But I knew deep down, his success hadn't come alone. It had cost my sleepless nights, debts only I carried, and a youth I traded for his degrees. Beside him, his wife, Sophie, elegant, flawless, with a gaze that weighed more than words. I remember the first time I saw her, red dress, high heels, queen-like posture. She measured the world in appearances, and I always felt that, to her, I was nothing but an inconvenience in her husband's life. The perfect father-in-law for Sophie would have been wealthy, polished, someone she could show off. Me? I was just a retired carpenter, a man with rough hands and the smell of wood on his skin. I was never the picture she wanted. And then there was my daughter, Laura, the youngest, the nurse, the one who never turned her back on me. With her, every word was simple, every hug real. Laura carried something money can't buy, empathy. She saw in me not just a father, but the man who fought so she and her brother could have choices. Maybe that's why, whenever I struggled to breathe, she reminded me there was still love in my own home. As I thought of them, I closed my eyes and felt the rain from the day before all over again. And what hurt most wasn't the water running down my face. It was the contrast between the world I had built and the world Michael now flaunted. His house was the opposite of mine. Modern facade, wide glass windows, polished marble floors. Every detail seemed to say, the past doesn't belong here. And maybe that was the truth. Maybe I was just an uncomfortable memory, a shadow he wanted erased. I still remember the sound of laughter from inside while I stood on the porch. Sophie, probably setting the dinner table. Michael, likely speaking loud about the latest case he had won. And me, invisible, while my own blood celebrated. Life as if I no longer existed. That night, I looked at my hands, the veins bulging, the calluses that never went away. These hands had raised walls, held heavy beams, shaped wood into works that still stood around the city. Many people had a piece of me inside their homes, tables, doors, staircases. But inside my own family, I was disposable. And you know what hurt the most? The memory of when Michael was a boy. He used to run through the workshop, sawdust stuck in his hair, begging to hold the saw I'd never let him touch. He looked at me as if I were the strongest man in the world. And now he looked at me as if I were a burden, a setback, a stone in his path. Laura called me that same night. She always had the gift of calling when I needed to hear a voice the most. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked. I took a deep breath. I couldn't tell her. I only said, "I'm fine, honey. Just a long day." But my silence betrayed me. She didn't insist, maybe, out of respect. But I know on the other end of the line, she felt it, because Laura always felt it. I looked again at the living room wall. The old family portrait was still there. Me, holding little Michael in my arms, Laura with braids, and their mother, smiling. A simple picture, taken with a cheap camera. But for me, it was proof that we had once been a home, that we had once been whole. Now, it looked only like a framed memory, as if happiness had been frozen forever in that instant. And that night, staring at that picture, I understood the truth. My family still existed, but it wasn't the same. Michael had chosen another path, and I had been left behind. Deep down, though, I knew life still had a scene waiting for me. Not one under the rain, but one in front of everyone who applauded him. And when that day came, he would remember who really laid the foundation of his life. When I close my eyes and think about my life, I don't see framed diplomas or fancy offices. I see sawdust floating in the air, piles of wood stacked in the corner, the smell of varnish soaked into the floor of my old workshop. That's where I spent most of my days and my nights. That's where I built the life that supported my family. I was always a carpenter, not by accident, but by love. From a young age, I learned to turn wood into something useful, solid, beautiful. Where others saw logs and planks, I saw tables where families would laugh together, beds where children would dream, doors that would open paths. And maybe that was my greatest pride, knowing that my rough, marked hands had the power to build homes. I didn't have the chance to study much. School ended early, and life started early too. But I never lacked the will to learn. Every project was a challenge, and I accepted them all. If I had to stay up all night to finish a staircase on time, I stayed up. If I had to sell my lunch to buy tools, I sold it. That's how I grew. That's how I slowly managed to build not only my house, but also my children's future. I remember the day Michael told me he wanted to be a lawyer. He was just 15. His eyes were bright, full of ambition. I knew it wouldn't be easy. College, books, housing, none of it fit within my reality. But when he said, "Dad, I'm going to be someone important," I promised myself I'd make it happen, even if it cost me everything I had. And it did cost me. I sold my old Chevrolet pickup, companion of so many deliveries. It was more than a car. It was a piece of my history. Watching the buyer drive away with it felt like they were tearing something out of me. But in return, I gained something bigger, the chance to see my son dream higher. The years were hard. Few people knew it, but I worked double, in the workshop by day, unloading trucks at freight companies by night. I slept 3, maybe 4 hours. Many times, little Laura would come into the living room in the middle of the night and find me slumped over papers, hands raw with calluses, but with a hidden smile, because somehow I was making it happen. When Michael finally graduated, I remember the pride swelling in my chest. I was sitting in the back row of the auditorium. My clothes were plain, my shoes worn. Sophie, his girlfriend at the time, didn't look at me once, but I didn't care. I saw my son in cap and gown, receiving applause, and I felt as if every clap was also for me. I knew that diploma didn't just carry the university's signature, it carried my sweat, my youth, my tired bones. But with time, I realized something. Memories of sacrifice fade. Gratitude has a short expiration date in some people's lives. Michael never went hungry, never had to work before studying, never had to say no to a dream, all because someone, me, had already paid the price. But instead of recognition, I found forgetfulness, and worse, disdain. At family gatherings, he spoke about important clients, about cases won, about trips abroad. I shrank back, not because I wasn't proud, but because I saw his eyes, not the eyes of a son looking at a father, but the eyes of a man looking at an old man who'd been left behind. Sophie's glances only reinforced it, looks that said more than 1,000 words. It hurt because I knew the truth. I knew that without my calloused hands he might never have gotten where he was, but I said nothing. I swallowed it in silence, until that rainy afternoon, the one where he left me outside. That was when I realized there's no point in building the world if, inside your own house, you're treated as nothing. And that's why I want to ask you, listening to me now, if this story touches you in any way, if you've ever been made to feel invisible even after giving everything you had, leave a comment here. Your voice matters. Every time you comment and subscribe, you help prove that a man's worth doesn't disappear just because others chose to forget. Because in the end, dignity is not inherited, it's earned, and I was still ready to earn mine back. That Saturday is still etched in me like a scar. The sky woke up heavy, loaded, as if it sensed the scene that was about to unfold. I had arranged to meet Michael to deliver some documents, important papers related to the land still in my name. He insisted it would be better to discuss them in person, at his house. I admit I went with an open heart, believing that maybe this meeting could be a step toward reconciliation. I put on my best coat, a brown wool one that had seen better days, but still gave me a sense of dignity. I grabbed the leather folder holding the documents and walked to the bus stop. Along the way, the wind already announced the coming storm. Trees swayed, street signs groaned, and the smell of wet earth began to rise. By the time I stepped off at the corner of his street, the rain poured down, heavy drops, sharp as needles on my face. I quickened my pace, held the folder tight under my arm, and climbed the sidewalk. The neighborhood was beautiful, quiet, with well-kept gardens and imported cars lined up in garages. Every detail of that street seemed to shout prosperity, the very prosperity I had helped build for my son. I reached the door, took a deep breath, knocked. The sound echoed against the varnished wooden porch. I waited. My heart pounded fast, as if it already knew something I didn't want to admit. I knocked again, harder this time. I saw a shadow move past the upstairs window. My chest loosened for a moment. He was home. Michael was there. But then the minutes started to pass. The pounding rain on the roof muffled the silence inside the house. I shifted from one foot to the other, trying to hide my anxiety. My coat grew heavy with water, the wool clinging to me like a cold weight. The wind made the trees groan, and each gust felt like it was pushing me back toward the street. I looked up at the window again. A light was on, and then I heard something I'll never forget. The metallic snap of the lock. Not opening, locking. My shoulders sank. It was as if an invisible hammer had struck me in the chest. He knew I was there. This wasn't neglect. It wasn't absence. It was a choice. With every second, the humiliation became clearer. The cold no longer came from the rain, but from the rejection. I glanced around. A neighbor cracked open his curtain, peeked quickly, and then shut it again. That look of pity lasted only a moment, but it was enough to cut me. I felt like a silent spectacle, a man rejected by his own family. The leather folder began to slip from my wet hand. I gripped it tightly. It was almost symbolic. I wasn't just holding papers, I was holding the weight of an entire life. And on the other side of that door, my own son was denying me even the dignity of shelter. Time lost all measure. I don't know if it was minutes or hours. What I do know is that every second there felt like an eternity. My hair dripped water down my face. My shoes were soaked through. My breathing grew heavier. The only company I had was the relentless sound of rain, mixed with the faint echo of laughter from inside. Yes, I heard it. Muffled laughter, voices in conversation. They weren't sleeping. They weren't out. They were there, and they had simply decided to ignore me. In that instant, a memory struck me. I saw little Michael again, running to me in the workshop, begging to help sand a board. I saw his proud smile when he held the first wooden toy I ever made for him. I saw his eyes shine. When he received his college acceptance letter, all of it flashed before me like a movie, and it all ended at that closed door, locked against me. The cold began to mix with anger. Not explosive anger, but a slow, burning fire inside. My teeth chattered. My hands shook, but within me something was growing, something I couldn't yet name, but stronger than pain. I could have walked away. I could have shouted, pounded on the door, made a scene, but I stayed. I stayed because deep inside, I wanted him to feel the weight of my waiting. I wanted him to know I was there, present, and that the choice to ignore me would be his alone. When I finally decided to leave, the sky was already starting to lighten behind the heavy clouds. The storm was losing strength, but inside me, it was only beginning. I walked slowly down the wet street, my shoes splashing through puddles. Every step was heavy, not just with water, but with the burden of humiliation. And on that walk home, a certainty began to take shape. That scene would not be forgotten. The rain that had punished me that afternoon would not be erased. I would find a way to return it, not with shouting, not with violence, but with something far harsher. The silence of contempt turned into justice. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew that one day, that same feeling of waiting would fall upon him, only not on a porch. It would happen where he least expected it, in front of everyone who admired him. That Saturday, soaked and alone, something was born in me. Not just pain, but a promise that would become the turning point of my life. After that rainy afternoon, something inside me cracked, but it wasn't a sudden break. It was like a fracture in glass, invisible to some, but spreading slowly, inevitably, until the whole pane shatters. In the days that followed, I realized Michael's rejection hadn't been an isolated event. It was just the cruelest snapshot of something that had been growing quietly all along. The little injustices, the cold gestures, the cutting words, they had always been there. I just hadn't wanted to see them. I remembered the first time I visited their new house, months before that night in the rain. Sophie opened the door. Her polite smile never reached her eyes. "Oh, hi, Thomas. What a surprise." The word surprise came out sounding more like inconvenience. I walked in, carrying a simple cake Laura and I had baked together. I set it on the marble kitchen counter. Polished, expensive, cold. Sophie glanced at it and murmured, "How thoughtful," then quickly pushed the plate aside, replacing it with a fancy imported tart from a high-end bakery. That day I realized, it wasn't just the front door closing to me. It was also the space in their hearts. And then there was Christmas dinner. The table was full, lights twinkling, fine wine pouring into crystal glasses. I sat in a corner, watching. At one point, Michael began telling the guests about an investment he had made. His words cut deep. "Today I have security because I know how to manage money, unlike certain people who don't understand finances at all." The table laughed, as if it were just a harmless joke, but I knew exactly who he meant. My throat went dry. I clenched my hands on my lap, trying to hide the flush on my face. No one defended me, not even Laura. She only lowered her eyes, as if sharing the pain in silence. Another time, at a Sunday barbecue, a friend asked him where the money for law school had come from. Michael laughed, shrugged, and said, "Oh, I worked hard for it, made it happen." I swallowed hard. Not a word about the nights I stayed awake, about the truck I sold, about the calluses that still marked my hands. It was as if I had never existed in that story, as if his diploma had sprouted from nothing, clean, effortless, without sweat, without sacrifice. It was those little stabs that killed me inside, not the single brutal blow, but the steady drip of contempt. Sophie avoided introducing me to her friends, referring to me only as Michael's father, never by name, never for who I really was. Michael himself spoke of me only as a simple carpenter, as if it were some lower category. And yet, all the furniture in the first house he lived in as a married man had been made by me. The bed, the table, the shelves. I saw my mark everywhere, but no one remembered. It was as if my hands were condemned to be forgotten, while his hands shone with art, contracts and signatures. Each small injustice was another drop corroding the stone, until, in silence, the anger began to turn into something else, determination. I wasn't after blind revenge, but I needed the truth to come out. That one day, in front of everyone, he would be forced to face what he had tried to erase, who had really built the foundation of his life. Sometimes I asked myself if I was exaggerating, if resentment was making me see shadows larger than they really were. But then I remembered the sharp glances, the cutting words, the doors shut in my face. No, it wasn't in my head. It was real. It was daily. It was cruel. Back then I started writing in an old notebook. I wrote everything down, every detail, every phrase, every situation, not to feed hatred, but to make sure my memory wouldn't be erased, because I realized that was their weapon, to make me invisible, and I would not allow myself to disappear from the very story I had built. And that's why I want to speak directly to you listening right now. Has anyone ever stolen your place in your own story? Pretended that everything you did had no value? Write it here in the comments. Your voice matters, and every comment is a reminder that no one can be erased from their own life. And subscribe to the channel. Every time you do, we prove together that dignity is never begged for, it's earned. Slowly, each small injustice began to change me. I was no longer just a man wounded by indifference. I was becoming someone preparing in silence for the day of reckoning. After so many sharp glances, cutting phrases, and slammed doors, I learned to keep quiet. But it was no longer the silence of someone who accepts. It was the silence of someone who prepares. I started looking at my life not as a defeated man, but as someone who still held pieces of the game in his hands. And I did, more than Michael and Sophie could ever imagine. That same week he left me standing in the rain. I pulled out an old leather folder from the back of the closet, the same one I had carried the day of his graduation. Inside, yellowed by time, were documents most people would have forgotten. Deeds, contracts, receipts. The land he assumed was his was still in my name. The house where the family had grown up too. All of it still registered under the signature of a man who, in their eyes, no longer had value. I spent whole nights sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing every page. The desk lamp cast a faint glow over the papers, and though the pen shook in my tired hand, it was not from doubt. I read every clause, every date, as if I were reclaiming not only rights, but also fragments of my dignity. In silence, I drew up a plan. There would be no shouting, no empty confrontations. I would not be the old man who argued at the dinner table only to be mocked behind closed doors. I would be the man who, with stamped papers and signatures, made the world hear what they tried to silence. The first visit to the notary's office was on a cloudy morning. I walked in with steady steps, though inside my palms were sweating. The clerk looked at me with indifference, as if I were just another old man lost in bureaucracy. But when I laid the documents on the desk, something shifted. He adjusted his glasses, read the signatures, flipped through the pages. "Are you the sole owner?" "Yes, I am." My voice came out low, but firm. I signed new papers, requested updates, made changes only I knew about. Meanwhile, on the outside, I stayed silent. I attended family gatherings, endured the comments, pretended not to notice the mocking laughs, but inside me, I carried a greater secret. They no longer had the control they thought they did. I went back to the office other times. Each stamp felt like a quiet blow against the mask Michael wore in public. With every signature of mine, he slipped further from the pedestal he had built, and all of it happened without him knowing. There was a moment I almost gave up. I sat on a park bench, the documents resting on my lap, and wondered if it was worth it, if I should just let it all go and live my remaining days in peace. But then I remembered the snap of the lock, the weight of the rain on my shoulders, the pity in the neighbor's eyes, and I understood. This wasn't just about property, it was about memory, about respect, about justice. Day by day my posture changed. Silence, once heavy, became armor. They laughed. I simply observed. They belittled me. I stored it away. Sophie avoided introducing me to her friends. I smiled faintly, knowing that when the time came, no mask would hold. Laura, my daughter, was the only one who noticed the difference. One night, while visiting, she found me at the table, papers spread out, pen in hand. "Dad, what is all this?" I looked at her and only answered, "Just getting my life in order." She didn't push. She simply placed her hand over mine, a gesture of silent complicity. Deep down, maybe she knew something bigger was happening. That process gave me strength. For the first time in years, I felt I wasn't at the mercy of their indifference, that I still had something to say, something that could rewrite the story they were trying to erase. And so, in silence, I built my own stage. A stage made of stamped pages, signatures, and seals. A stage that didn't need applause, only undeniable facts. There was no rush. I knew time worked in my favor. Humiliation is not avenged with speed, but with precision. And when the opportunity came, and it would come, I would be ready. It was in that silent waiting that I learned one of life's greatest lessons. Sometimes the loudest voice is not the one that shouts. It's the one that waits, prepares, and chooses the exact moment to be heard. At that time, no one imagined it. Not Sophie, with her sharp looks. Not Michael, with his proud speeches. But every family dinner, every holiday, every offhand comment, all of it was just another piece fitting into the board I had already laid out. And I knew, when the day of revelation arrived, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. All I'd have to do was open the leather folder, lay it on the table, and let the papers speak for me. The day of the confrontation wasn't chosen at random. It was Michael's birthday. He himself had made a point of throwing a grand party in the hall of his new house. He invited colleagues from the firm, influential friends, in-laws, neighbors. With every invitation, I knew he wasn't just celebrating. He wanted to show the world who he had become. I arrived early, but not so early as to be invisible. I walked in through the front door, wearing a simple but neatly pressed suit, the leather folder firm in my hand. The contrast was clear. Me, modest, in clothes worn by years, and them, glittering in expensive attire. But I didn't care. That day I didn't need to compete in appearances. I carried something stronger than any silk tie. The hall glowed, with modern chandeliers, and the main table was a display of excess. Crystal glasses, imported dishes, exotic flowers. Sophie floated through the room like a flawless hostess, embracing guests, smiling at everyone. Everyone except me. Her glance slid past me as if I were an inconvenient shadow on the wall. Michael, meanwhile, was at the center of it all. He gestured confidently, his voice strong, his laughter loud. Every sentence seemed designed to impress. At one point, he raised his glass and said, "Today is not just my birthday. It's the celebration of a life of effort, of hard work, of achievements I built with my own two hands." The guests applauded. I felt my grip tighten on the leather folder. My own hands, calloused, forgotten, throbbed with indignation. I waited. It wasn't the moment yet, I observed. Wine flowed. Soft music filled the air. Conversations overlapped. I sat quietly in a corner, almost invisible, but with the certainty that soon it would be impossible not to see me. When the cake arrived, decorated with golden candles, Michael called everyone together for the final toast. His voice rang out through the hall. "I want to thank each of you who has been with me on this journey. None of this would have been possible without determination, intelligence, and vision." More applause, more smiles. That's when I stood up. The scrape of my chair against the marble floor broke the rhythm of the party for a moment. Every eye turned to me. I walked toward the center, the echo of my steps pounding like drums through the sudden silence. I set the leather folder on the table, right in front of the untouched cake. The sharp thud of it against the glass made a few people glance at one another. I opened it slowly. The zipper slid back, and it was as if the air caught in everyone's lungs. The first yellowed pages appeared, aged but heavy with weight. I looked at Michael. His smile faltered. For the first time that night, he had no words. "You speak of achievements, son." My voice came out steady, steadier than I expected. "But you forget that the foundation of your life wasn't built with your own hands." Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. Sophie stepped forward, trying to intervene. "Thomas, maybe this isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," I cut in, without raising my voice. I pulled out the deed to the land, raised it high so everyone could see the stamp, the signature. "Here it is. The land you claim as yours is still mine." A murmur rippled through the hall. Someone whispered, "My God." Then I drew out another document, the family house, And here, the house you grew up in, every wall raised by these hands. I lifted my hands, the calluses still visible. None of this has been erased, no matter how hard you tried to bury the memory of the man who gave you the ground to walk on. Now the silence was absolute. The sound of candles burning on the cake seemed deafening. Michael tried to recover, straightened his body, adjusted his jacket. This is a misunderstanding. These papers don't. I cut in again, locking eyes with him. Then read the signatures. Look at the records. Everything is still in my name. He took the papers, hands trembling. The same hands that once turned contracts with confidence now shook in front of everyone. The guests watched in shock. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others stared at Michael as if the image of success had just collapsed. Laura, my daughter, stepped forward quietly. She took my arm. Her tear-filled eyes told me everything without a word. Pride, finally. Pride. I looked around. Every face was proof, every silence, a verdict. I didn't need to shout. The documents spoke for me. The truth was stamped, sealed, undeniable. And for the first time in a long while, I was no longer the small one in the room. The entire hall seemed suspended in the air. No one touched the cake. No one refilled their glass. The laughter that once filled the space had vanished, as if it had never existed. The only sound was paper trembling in Michael's hands. I stood in silence. The son, who always spoke with such certainty before judges and clients, could barely hold his gaze on me. Sophie, beside him, was frozen. Her red lipstick looked harsher against the sudden pallor of her face. Her fingers gripped her husband's arm, as if reminding him to breathe. And then, in the middle of that dense silence, Michael tried to fight back. His voice wavered, though arrogance still clung to it. These documents, this changes nothing. I built my life. Everyone here knows who I am, what I've achieved. I looked at him calmly, letting each second weigh on his desperate attempt to keep the mask on. The hall waited for my reply as if for a verdict. Then I stepped closer to the table, spread my hands on the glass surface, and said, low but firm, "One day you left me waiting in the rain. Now it's you who will wait at the courthouse." The words cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then came the murmurs. A tall man in a gray suit coughed awkwardly, not knowing where to look. A woman whispered, "My God," loud enough to be heard. Even the waiter holding a tray stopped mid-step, as if he'd forgotten where he was going. Michael froze. His eyes darted from me to the papers, from the papers to the guests, and back to me. There was no escape. No legal argument could erase that scene. No speech could undo what everyone had just witnessed. He opened his mouth, shut it again, tried once more. "Dad, you didn't have to." I raised my hand, stopping him, and let out another short phrase, almost whispered, but it echoed through the hall. "Respect isn't begged for, it's imposed." A shiver ran through the room, not because I shouted, but because I didn't. There was no anger in my voice. There was certainty. Laura stood beside me. I saw her cover her mouth with her hand, eyes glistening, then look at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Pride. She didn't need to say a word. The light in her eyes was proof I wasn't alone. Sophie, on the other hand, stepped back. Her body trembled slightly, though her face still tried to hold an expression of control. It was useless. That was the moment when masks fell. I looked at Michael again. Inside, something still ached, because before anything else, he was my son. But that pain was accompanied by a strength I hadn't felt in decades. For the first time, he no longer had power over me. His words, his absence, his disdain, none of it defined who I was anymore. In that moment, I was no longer the father humiliated on the porch, nor the invisible man at family dinners. I was the owner of my own story. One bold guest stepped closer to Michael and, without hiding it, asked, "Is it true? Everything's still in your father's name?" Michael didn't answer. He just lowered his eyes. And in that gesture, in his shameful silence, I felt the complete reversal. The victory wasn't in the papers on the table, but in the fact that, in front of everyone, he was forced into silence. I took one last step back, closed the leather folder calmly, and held it against my chest. I drew in a deep breath, like a man resurfacing after years underwater. And before turning to leave, I looked at him one last time. "Never forget, Michael. The storm always returns to the one who summons it." There were no applause, no shouts, only the weight of silence, the crackle of candles burning, and the pounding hearts of everyone in that room. And I knew, in that instant, this wasn't just my turning point. It was his downfall. After I closed the folder and left my final words hanging in the air, I realized it wasn't only Michael who had lost his voice. The entire hall seemed swallowed by an uneasy silence, the kind no one dares to break. It was as if they were all trapped between the urge to flee and the need to witness the last breath of that scene. The guests began glancing at one another. A gray-haired man, Michael's law partner, tugged nervously at his shirt cuffs. A woman across the table let out a loud sigh, just enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was judgment. Sophie was the first to move. She stepped toward Michael, clutching his arm tightly, as if trying to keep him from collapsing in front of everyone. But the gesture looked more like desperation than support. Her face was pale, and her red lipstick seemed out of place, like a loud color painted across ruin. Michael tried to cling to what little composure he had left. He ran a hand through his hair, adjusted his jacket, but every movement betrayed his nerves. He cleared his throat, lifted his chin, and tried to speak. "Everyone, this is just a misunderstanding. My father, he doesn't understand how things work today." The sentence died before it finished. One guest let out a laugh, not from humor, but disbelief. Others whispered to each other. I knew exactly what was happening. Michael's authority, built so carefully over the years, was shattering right there before their eyes. He looked at me, searching perhaps for a lifeline, a shred of mercy. I offered him nothing but silence, the same silence he once gave me on that porch in the rain. His in-laws, until then proud of their perfect son-in-law, rose discreetly. Sophie's mother grabbed her leather purse without daring to meet my eyes. Her father leaned toward Michael and said in a low but audible voice, "We expected more from you," and they walked out. With every passing minute, the party was turning into a courtroom. There was no need for judge or jury. The verdict was already in the air, heavy, suffocating. Michael was being condemned not by law but by truth. Laura, my daughter, remained by my side. I watched her lift her chin, proud to carry my name for the first time in years. That small, almost imperceptible gesture was proof that I was no longer alone in this silent war. Desperate, Michael still tried to seize back control. He slapped his hand against the table, raised his voice. "You don't understand. This changes nothing. I'm still who I am. No one here has the right to judge me." But it was too late, especially because he was a lawyer. Everyone knew. Documents speak louder than speeches, and mine were right there, stamped, sealed, undeniable. Sophie, realizing there was no escape, let go of his arm and stepped back. It was as if she wanted to detach herself, to escape the sinking ship before it went down with her. Her eyes betrayed her frustration, not with me, but with her husband, who had let the mask slip in front of everyone. I saw some of Michael's colleagues quietly collecting their coats, others checking their watches, eager to leave without looking like accomplices. One by one, the guests began to scatter. There was no party anymore, only ruins. Michael stood frozen, staring at the folder on the high table as if it were a bomb that could still go off, but there was nothing left to explode. The damage was already done. I drew a deep breath, looked around, and realized something. I hadn't needed to raise my voice, hadn't needed loud revenge. The truth, revealed at the right moment, carries enough weight to bring down any facade. Michael tried to step toward me, his eyes glossy with anger and shame. "Dad, we can talk. This didn't have to." I stopped him with a firm look. There was nothing left to say. Conversation was what I had longed for all my life. What he gave me instead was silence, contempt, and locked doors. Now, finally, he was the one tasting the bitter silence of exclusion. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel the eyes on my back. Not the eyes of pity, like the neighbor once gave me in the rain. These were eyes of recognition. The forgotten carpenter, the invisible man, had just revealed who really held the foundation. And in that moment, I understood. The real reckoning wasn't only in the documents, nor in the inheritance he would lose. It was in the respect he would never regain before those who had witnessed his fall. That night, when I closed Michael's front door behind me, I didn't feel euphoria. There were no cheers, no triumphant victory. What filled me was a silence, but not the heavy silence of that porch in the storm. A lighter silence, a silence of peace. I walked along the sidewalk, the cold wind against my face. The wealthy neighborhood's streets were nearly deserted, the streetlights casting yellow reflections on puddles the rain hadn't yet dried. This time, my steps weren't heavy, they were steady. Each strike of my shoes against the pavement felt like the mark of a new beginning. When I got home, the old armchair in the living room was waiting for me, as always. I sat down, laid the folder on the side table, and just looked around. Everything was simple. The old clock, the lamp with its stained shade, the faint smell of wood still clinging to the walls. But for the first time in many years, I didn't see scarcity. I saw history. I saw roots. I saw dignity. Laura came the next morning. She walked in without knocking, the way she always had since she was little. She found me in the kitchen, stirring coffee. She hugged me without a word. Only after a few seconds did she whisper, "Dad, last night I've never been so proud to be your daughter." Those words were worth more than any property, more than any victory, because they were proof that everything I had done, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every callus on my hands hadn't been in vain. Maybe Michael had chosen the path of forgetting, but Laura kept alive the memory of what truly matters: respect. I spent days reflecting on what had happened. I thought of Michael, of Sophie, of the faces of the guests. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't need to. Life had already exacted its price, and I knew that from then on, they would never be able to hide what everyone had seen. Arrogance always crumbles when confronted with truth. I looked at my hands, marked by time. For so long, I thought they only existed to carry weight, to build things that would later be forgotten. But in that moment, I understood. These hands also knew how to hold on to dignity, and no one could take that away from me. Deep down, I realized the true turning point wasn't about Michael. It was about me, about learning that silence is not submission, that kindness is not weakness, that a man can age in body, but never loses the right to respect. And maybe that's the greatest lesson I can leave. No matter how many times they try to diminish you, no matter how many doors are slammed shut in your face, never hand over to anyone else the power to define who you are. Dignity isn't begged for. Dignity is earned every single day. Today, when I walk the streets, I don't bow to looks of pity, because I am no longer the drenched man left outside, treated as a burden. I am the man who rose in silence and proved at the right moment that even forgetfulness can be defeated by memory. And if one day Michael comes looking for me again, and maybe that day will come, when he needs more than he has to give, I don't know how I'll react. Maybe I'll listen, maybe I won't. But one thing is certain, I will never forget what I lived through. Because once you've tasted the bitter flavor of betrayal, you learn to savor even more the value of your own dignity. And now I want to hear from you. Has anyone ever tried to silence your voice inside your own home? Have they ever made you feel invisible, as if nothing you did had any worth? Share it in the comments. Your story matters, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because every time you comment, every time you take part, we prove together that no one can ever steal what is most sacred, the right to be respected.